My video cut off when I put the plug in, so we'll probably have to just cut these up a little bit, especially with these longer ones. Might even cut this into a third. I had time for a burrito, and I'm just gonna drink a bit of a beer, maybe. So we'll dig into, we were looking at purple, the magical stage, and I was just finishing off with it. I wasn't quite done, but a lot of I'm putting kind of notation in between it to kind of flesh out the model a little bit as we go. Some of the formalities weren't addressed at the beginning, so I kind of interjected that throughout. So how do we make the transition to the next stage successfully? Think the following case study expressed beautifully by Father Thomas Keating. There was a study done a few years ago by Miami School of Medicine wherein premature infants placed in isolation wards were tested on the effects of human physical interaction. Half of the children were touched a few times a day by other human adults, while the infants were not touched. Everything other than the fact that they were touched or not remained equal between the two groups. The results were dramatic. The infants touched grew 50% faster, healthier, were released from the hospital a week earlier, and showed more agility in later tests. In other words, we are emotional beings, and this need must be fulfilled for advance in healthy manner. So red, power gods. This is Wilbur's first-person perspective, but it also comes from red in both accounts. Starting 10,000 years ago, this value system emerged out of the context of the previous stage, as is probably always the case. In other words, you need the previous stage to build off the next stage. And I don't know if I talk about this, I'll just get into this a little bit, but there's this idea in spiral dynamics that, the previous stage, in essence, both creates conditions for which it's going to run up against itself. In other words, its own complexity runs out and it needs a new operating system. But it also self-generates so that, previous people down the road will follow the same pattern. They'll have to go through that in a sense. It's a pattern that emerges in the nature of things. Whether or not this is global, in other words, another planet would have the same sort of pattern or not, is a bit of an open question because we don't have other planets to compare. But on this planet, it's shown time and time again. So it can be described as egocentric or exploitive power god. So I noted in that early example with the bees, I called it egocentric. So this is the stage where little Max, I think his name was centered in. He's, early emotional, first person kind of point of view. The person embodying this value system in a very real sense, and for the first time, has established a real mind of his own or her own. The person living in this value system broke away from the established traditions and ventured out without any guilt to create the first early empires, to build towers to the gods, and through this process to become gods themselves. At least they thought themselves to be gods sometimes. Through the hierarchical control, oftentimes, some would say not, but I think usually that's the case, of the people and resources around him or her. There is some research studies, and this is important to note, that nobody in Egypt were slaves. I'm still not sold on this, but that is what the research seems to suggest. So that might be an interesting caveat. Although in most other early, pyramid, I think in the Mayan cultures and stuff, there's generally tons of slaves involved. So prior to this, though, slaves weren't that common because we didn't actually have enough understanding of ourselves to really create ownership of another. It just wasn't even cognitively capable. So it's a later ability to actually build a slave trade in some sense. The first real forms of written communication and written mathematics began to develop, allowing more complex forms of social relations and infrastructure to be built. The massiveness of the structures built within the context of those holding this value system was possible, to a large extent, due to the rulers using all humans without guilt for their own needs. In other words, the reason why the structures could be built on such a massive scale within such a still primitive context was that those rulers weren't taking into account the extreme suffering of those to fulfill their own goals. They were using them as a means to an end. We would at present consider such systems to be tyrannical, which is true, but at the time such systems, despite their cruelty, all the heads that rolled, was a cutting edge of Earth's evolutionary development, you might argue, manifesting itself in human beings. Within such society, and there were better and worse versions of this, not all were so cruel, but often this is the way it evolves. Within such societies, there's much more stratification, the haves and the have-nots, which we in many regards are still seeing presently, and I will make the connection on how these two things come together later in this book. That is, the nature of this developmental process which at one time in the past was cutting edge through time will be transcended and included, and thus the morals, ideas, and cognitions of the past, when applied today, become dangerous and repugnant, as they are, to whatever extent, dated and not in line with the spirit of the times. The Zeitgeist, as the Germans may say. Further, the Zeitgeist can be pathological, unhealthy, when aspects of one's developmental system, for example, is cutting edge. But another part, maybe a big part, is entrenched in primitive caveman understanding. For example, high cognitive understanding, great ability to understand what there is in reality, this is just an example, coupled with low morals, a refusal or inability to take the perspective of other sentient beings. So that would be, you can be a Nazi scientist in that sense. Highly cognitive, low morals. The idea is essential to this book as a whole, and so if we get to the end of it, I hope this particular idea is fleshed out well for you and from many different angles. But I digress. We still may see red in gang culture where every man and woman is out for themselves. It's a jungle out there, and the strongest survives in this red world. So red again is taken from the book Spiral Dynamics, so let's read it. Bands which drove them to go west, away from the restraints of civilization. Fortunately, there was the frontier where they could be free and explore. One of the greatest challenges facing the developed nations today is finding new horizons where red energy can be released constructively. This is difficult because bottling it up in urban squalor only builds anger. Yet, colonial exploitation of the third world is not acceptable as it once was. Where can red go for fun and adventure? The streets and video games? Strong positive red examples abound in cartoons, legends and myths. Paul Bunyan, John Henry, that's I think from the Steel Driving Man, Big Bad John, Rambo, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator. So note the maleness here. Only recently has U.S. sort of society acknowledged that while testosterone sort of plays a role in red behavior, the V-meme is equally accessible to women. So V-meme liberator Tanya Harding indelicately disclosed that red is present in figure skating as well as hockey. It's kind of a joke a little bit, but here's another bullet point, as it were, from the book. So, power-based egocentric worldview, or red. This worldview marks the emergence of the sense of self, or ego, distinct from the tribe. Although this individual will act impulsively on behalf of its favored group, seeing itself as the center of the world, or egocentric, the power-based worldview, individualized self, seeks to express and fulfill its wants and desires immediately. It's all about me. People with this worldview don't plan for the future, but rather act impulsively to get what they want now. This worldview sees itself as the center of its own hero's quest and includes powerful gods, goddesses, people and forces to be reckoned with. Life is a wild jungle with predators and prey. To avoid threats and survive, this worldview exerts its own power and seeks to align with a powerful leader. They live by survival of the fittest maximum of the jungle. But if you're a weaker individual or a group, it often serves you better to submit to the warlord or chief, accepting your place in the dominating power structure in exchange for protection and a share of the spoils. This is the express self meme. In other words, it is individual focused. And so we're going to move back and forth here as we go. The first one is individual focused. The next one is sort of collective focused, and then individual focused. I'm going to make a theory, and it's just a theory, that expresses that in a little bit more dynamic aspects. But for now, this is just something to keep in mind. That's how culture moves, that kind of extreme back and forth. The red to blue transition. For those that don't know, I will reiterate the contours of the Oedipus myth. Oedipus unknowingly commits incest with his mother. He then goes to murder his father, which he also doesn't know is his father, killing him so he can be with the woman that he doesn't know is his own mother. He then learns that he had incest with his mother, and that was, in fact, his father that he just killed. Finally, he blinds himself due to the guilt he feels from the crimes he's committed. So Wilbur argues that this myth takes on an interesting form when he sees it from an evolutionary perspective. On the surface, Oedipus seems merely an innocent seeker and sufferer, making his way through a life that includes a rather nondescript killing and a not unordinary love affair. But beneath the surface, in the subconscious or offstage, Oedipus loves not just women, but his mother, and kills not just an adversary, but his father. And when Oedipus discovers his crime, when he makes the unconscious conscious, in other words, for the first time, the guilt drives him to self-inflicted blindness. Wilbur argues that the mother in the myth can be thought of as the great mother, or nature and emotions, and that the recognition of this incest is like one's movement from red impulses to amber, or in this case, what might be called blue, as we'll talk about, rules. One has some degree made more conscious their impulses and emotions. In other words, Oedipus has made his previous unconscious red-level impulses and emotions self-conscious. Having done so, he's disgusted with his actions, so he blinds himself. To take this one step further, the action of blinding oneself connects back interestingly to the sun god myths interpreted from a modern European Enlightenment paradigm. Sight is central within those myths, as sight is connected to one's reasoning capacities. Here Oedipus blinds himself, suggesting that he himself is incapable of reason. And again, reason isn't even something blue necessarily is capable of, but it's moving in that direction. Wilbur and Freud agree that there's a universal message behind this myth. Freud, for example, argues there are universal elements within this myth expressing the Oedipal problem, which is the fixation on oral, anal, and phallic body parts, and that there is also suggestive elements that point towards the struggle to move beyond the red system into a blue system that requires rules and roles that must be followed. So if red was self-centric, self-focused, I-oriented, blue becomes sociocentric, we-focused, group-focused, us against them focused. And the Oedipal myth is a good analogy of that transition period, going from one to the other, and this dynamic happening that spurs it forth. So let's dig into blue. Blue can be seen as sort of a truth force. I know the truth, and I'm standing for it to death. Sort of these sorts of things are often common. Wilbur's amber, or second person perspective. Again, we carry these, and they're so integral to our being. We need all of these dynamic to be healthy. But Transcendent include them in ways that can make them all work healthily. And our culture is not doing that very well, and we'll get into that later a little bit. And then that's part of why this is so important to think about, I think. But beyond that, we're going to integrate in other aspects that haven't been. So it's playing a couple roles here. Starting around 5,000 years ago, those that are centered in this worldview have a mythical view of reality. They usually bind themselves to one particular mythical story of reality and defend it at all costs. All of these mythical systems have radically important truths bound up in them. However, from this value system, these particular systems, often what we call religions, are held as an absolute in this truth system, complete and literally correct. However, cutting edge, these ancient mythological religions were thousands of years ago. Time has marched on, and so does the outward realities we face. Although these mythical religions have radically important insights regarding the depths of human interiority, which we generally do tend to neglect in the modern and postmodern world, very important aspect, the baby bathwater thing. These coming from this worldview often negate insights from the outside world. So blue tends to not be objective, that sort of exterior gaze in a certain kind of sense. We'll get into that later. They're not, it's not like they're blind to the outside world, of course, but we'll see. I'll explain it in a bit more detail later. Those coming from the worldview often blur the truth in the outside world with the particular mythology they hold as the whole truth. So that's a good overview of that in some sense. The term fundamentalist can be another way to point to this form of thinking, as there are different ways of being religious, and this way of being religious is one in which vagueness is often not tolerated. Black and white is the reality. And one of the tricky things is that, if spirituality is true, if there is legitimate forms of spirituality, how do we know to trust certain people and not trust certain people? How can we use reason? Later we'll talk about that, to negotiate some of these things. That's the tricky part of sussing some of this stuff out here when we deal with blue in particular. The term fundamentalist can be another way to point to this form of thinking, as there are different ways of being religious, and this way of being religious is one in which vagueness is not tolerated. In other words, black and white is the reality. It's either good or it's evil. You're either a saint or you're a sinner. And generally speaking, there is no middle ground. The perfect order that this system details allows people to create and live in a social network that upholds laws in all people within the system, but they need to live by those laws. Only and if they live by those laws can they be tolerated. The system curbed the impulsiveness of the red system, radically important. All that killing people, rolling the heads down pyramids, that was cut out with blue. None of that. You're gone. You're out. You're in jail or you're dead. To live with this blue society, you must follow rules, and those that follow the rules, the best in many, generally, hopefully, when it's a good, healthy system, those that follow the rules best are certain to clinch themselves eternal life, that side, and often positions of power too, ideally. In other words, those societies with a strong blue system tend to be strongly rule-based and orient themselves within a strict moral code. So you may be a Christian, for example, and not bound up with the mythical system, not interpret the Bible literally, and this is great, we'll get back to it later, and we got to flesh that out more. It's such a dicey and heavy thing to talk about, and I'm not saying I'm fully skilled and able to, but it's something to navigate, to get more complexity, healthy complexity into this debate here. Again, baby with the bathwater, I think there's radically important things we got to extract from those systems that we don't want to leave out. In other words, you may be Christian and either above or below this particular value system. So a Christian isn't relegated just to the mythological worldview. I believe a Christian can be rational. That sounds maybe like a contradiction to many of you, but I think that you can be a reasoned Christian. That is to say that to the degree to which you have knowledge, you believed Christ existed and said these sorts of things. You might not take too seriously, although you might hold open to some degree the potential that miracles and stuff occurred. But you're able to dance with the complexities of that. That would be a more reasoned position. And faith can still be in play to a degree, but even the faith is often questioned and struggled with in many respects. So in other words, you may be, said that. There are a lot of green level Christians, for example, and yellow level Christians, turquoise level Christians, and we'll get into that later as we go through these systems. You'll just know what those colors mean. The important point is that at the higher levels, if you develop in a healthy fashion, you are more open to insights from the worldviews and systems of thinking, not being strictly bound to a particular mythical view. We are, I believe, at a time, as people like Brian Swim suggest, ready for a new story and reality. And again, these are things that integrate that scientific paradigm with some of the best of the religious traditions. So a story that can include sort of the deep from Christianity or Buddhism, if you want, and so forth, depending on where you are in the world and where you come from. But to add these stories, novel psychological scientific understandings. So as we can see later, there's more than simply blue-level Christianity. There's red, blue, orange, green, yellow, and even turquoise levels of Christianity. Although they look radically different from each stage, if they've been healthily developed, even if they had been healthily developed. Here's an outline of blue in a nutshell. A single guiding force controls the world and determines our destiny. Its abiding truth provides structure and order for all aspects of living things and living here on earth and the rules of the heavens as well. My life has meaning because the fires of redemption burn in my heart. I follow the appointed pathway which ties me with something much greater than myself, a cause, a belief, a tradition, an organization, a movement, and I stand fast for what is right, proper, and good, always subjugating myself to the directives of proper authority. I willingly sacrifice my desires in the present, in the sure knowledge that I can look forward to something wonderful in the future. And it's such an important aspect of this, of, care that kind of emanates from that perspective, that often is so diminished in our culture, and it's so sad because it is such a powerful heart that bears itself in that position, that stand in the world, just putting your life on the line for others that love and trust in something bigger than themselves. Again, you might not believe in this structure, but that being that does that is honorable, I think, in many respects. The god or gods of the mythic worldview rule as deeply felt powers that have a direct hand in earthly affairs of men and women. Instead of being united only by blood and kinship, amber individuals of differing tribes or clans can believe in the same God and therefore all be united as brothers and sisters under that banner, that God. They live peacefully together if everyone around you are believers, and if not, you better watch out. Strict rules are set out and followed that maintain this established way of life and promote stability. Each individual must make sacrifices for God and country, which in the process gives an order and meaning to life. Our sacrifices and suffering in this worldview are thought to ennoble us. The violence and chaos of this amber worldview threatens this orderly world. Order and goodness depends on strict laws, strong police, and soldiers. These people are our heroes. All of us who work hard, obey the rules, and fulfill our social duties are honorable. Rules give life a clear, absolute meaning, direction, and purpose. There are higher principles that must be followed. Everyone has their proper place in society, held together by laws and religious commandments. They polarize, black and white, ethnocentric perspectives prevail throughout this. In other words, you are a believer or you are an infidel. You are a saint or you are a sinner. You are with us or you are against us. Guilt controls the impulsive actions that are of a red trait, the previous system. They're trying to control the red through discipline, allegiance to tradition, well-established ways of living, a sacrifice way of living. So that's That's blue. And now we're going to go into the blue to orange transition. So when blue doesn't work anymore, we start to move into this transition. In early democracies, Voltaire would say, remember the cruelties. This was in reference to the cruelties done by the early church establishment with its crusades and witch burnings and so forth. An important thing to remember is that the kind of believers doing these acts almost always came out of the red or amber values and worldviews. Amber worldviews tend to be radically ethnocentric, really almost by definition. The inability to look at others' perspectives objectively. They can take the other's perspectives, but they can't do it with an objective lens. So, which only begins to arise at the next stage, orange. In such cultures, if you did not follow the one God that was believed in that particular culture, you would normally be cast as a heathen and were necessarily not worthy of life or remorse. However, with the blooming of rationality, with the onset of the industrialized world, the majority of the modernizing populace's assumptions began to slowly shift. Ideals such as freedom, equality, and liberty became possibilities. Maybe not very real possibilities yet in the beginning, but it was only at the time that religion, morality, and science could be separated into distinct categories. Before that time, they were blended together. When you took a view on religion or subjectivity all the way up and down the spectrum of sentience, so you can be religious at any of these ways of thinking, you were in turn taking a perspective on science. The preacher in direct communion with God, as it says in the Bible, and the Bible is the truth, in other words. So this would be an uncommon way of thinking, not an uncommon way of thinking about blue thinkers. This is how they tend to think, right? And I mean, not bad. It's just that this is the way it is. You know, again, you can be Christian at different levels, but the kind of the Bible is the truth, full stop, is one way of looking at it. And there's other ways of looking at it that are more open and dynamic. So we live in a time where the cultural frameworks, and this includes those ancient meaning systems which were absolutistic, mythically based, are now open and available on a wide scale to be scrutinized. We live in a time where a Hindu can live next door to a Muslim, and a Muslim next door to a Buddhist, and a Buddhist next to an atheist. This was only made possible through the shift to a more corporate-based, nationalistic type of society that formed with the blooming of reason and industry. This is how at least the integral model presents it. So, and it makes a certain kind of sense. In a very real sense, all the world's traditions have dimensionalities of the others. This was a great step forward in many regards. The first tentative step to a worldwide inclusion of differing worldviews. The motto herein in the American Constitution was, "You can believe whatever you wish, any religion or atheistic stance. You just cannot act on certain impulses." That is, impulses that harm others directly and in some cases indirectly. You cannot deny those traditions' presence, as there will always be people moving through these different stages of development. So there will be people desiring mythical derived worldviews, and furthermore, they still offer some unique and important perspectives that we cannot forget, no matter how much we grow. They are a layer in our being in an important sense. Just 1 second, I'm going to have a sip of beer. My mouth's getting dry from all the talking. Oh no, beer's fizzing over. So there will be people desiring mythically derived worldviews, and furthermore, they still... It's terrible. Shouldn't have done that. Sorry. So there will be people desiring mythically derived worldviews, and furthermore, they still offer some unique and important perspectives that we can't BS. We just need to put these traditions on a kind of conveyor belt, an idea we'll look into later. It kind of helps promote the growth of consciousness, allowing individuals to frolic in the waters of amber mythical worldviews and then step into the rational world, to open into the pluralistic interpretations of the world's cultures and move on to start integrating into the world. This task mustn't be done in reductionist ways that reduce other systems out of existence, but rather ways that include the best of the past and move forward from there. Regarding the governance, this is an issue I will address at length in the next section and must take into account some deep history and a broader understanding of our present governance system, wherein our own government appears to be attempting to form a vertically integrated top-down system enforcing a governance structure upon the people, rather than allowing people to flourish where they're at. And here we must take a strong stand against that move in some sense, from strictly top-down governance approaches to integrating bottom-up, if not altogether different, which we'll discuss. So again, but that was the implementation of the Orange system, from the authoritarian monarchs to more of a nation state, sort of liberal democracy, as we might call it, a republic. Republic's probably the more apt word. The movement in Orange first saw its seeds arguably in and around the ancient Greek and Roman cultures. However, it started to come into real bloom during the Industrial Revolution. A polis within these cultures was oftentimes seen in an idealistic way. It was a Greek word for city-state and meant roughly a shared community and a community based on unrestrained communication. Because the conversation was intended to be unrestrained, there's a deeper element of freedom within such a culture compared to earlier cultures that tended to set absolute restraints on what was to be talked about and even thought, as these thoughts and actions needed to be synchronized with the authoritative view within these more ancient cultures. So thought crimes were fairly real and starting to become kind of real again, by allowing people to question the long-held views of Amber, left open the possibility to form even more coherent and distinctive idea systems. That is, by really applying novel methods of reason to questions, they were able to overturn some of their long-held assumptions on what reality is, what is meaningful, what is beautiful, and so on. So let's take Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, who criticized or at least was skeptical of many ideas, including the notion of might makes right, a still commonly held red power-based belief that flourished in Athenian society. He would often speak out against this and other widely held views at the time. So a nice and useful story to tell would be how he became seen as the gadfly, an upsetter of the status quo by the Athenians. The story involves a friend of Socrates asking an oracle of Delphi if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle said no one was wiser. Socrates, thinking that he wasn't wise, set out to put this statement to the test by probing those within the society whom considered themselves wise, statesmen, poets, and artisans. It turned out, from his perspective, that they did actually seem unwise. As the answers to the questions he posed, he could easily rebuke, and although he was not ready to consider himself wise, he had ruled out that the Athenian leaders weren't all that wise either, leading him to think that the oracle